There are two common rebuttals to the resurrection stories in the four Gospels. There are apparent contradictions regarding the women who first went to the tomb and the angels they saw. Most of the time, it's skeptics who bring these difficulties up with no intent in solutions. But I've been studying the Bible and Christianity for 15 years, and I can still have a hard time making sense of the discrepancies that appear between the Gospels. Overall, though, I'm convinced we can make sense of the women and the angels in the resurrection stories, and here's why. But first, let's talk about the actual contradictions. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all the chapters. Often when we're reading the Bible on our own, we miss these discrepancies because we read each gospel all the way through, one at a time. That is called vertical reading. However, if you read horizontally, you can read of the same account 2 to 4 times. It's 4 times with the resurrection. To read these stories horizontally, you'd want to read Matthew chapter 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, and John chapter 20 and 21. Here's the problem with the women. In Matthew, we have Mary Magdalene and the other Mary who visited the tomb. The other Mary was likely the mother of James the younger, who was one of the disciples. She was the wife of Clopas and the mother of Joseph. Mark has these two Marys plus Salome visit the empty tomb. Luke has these two Marys plus Joanna and the other women visit the tomb. John has only Mary Magdalene, and she goes to the tomb twice, before and after John and Peter. So there are similarities in their accounts, but there are enough differences for people to say they contradict each other and therefore are not true. They're fiction. But that's not all. Here's the problem with the angels. In Matthew, the angel rolled away the tombstone and sat on it when the women saw him, and then the angel invited them into the tomb where Jesus had been buried. In Mark, the women enter the tomb before they see what Mark describes as a young man sitting on the right, presumably an angel because he scared the women. Then in Luke, the women entered the tomb, and while they were in there, Luke records that 2 men wearing bleach white clothes appeared to them. They stood beside the women, and the women became scared. Like Mark, Luke assumed they were angels. John has only Mary Magdalene going to the tomb in the early morning, but she saw no angels on her first visit. Then she runs and tells Peter and John, and they run to the tomb. After they leave, Mary returned and is alone at the tomb. She bent over to look into it, and she saw 2 angels sitting on the stone slab where Jesus' body had been laying. Then she entered into a conversation with a man she thought was the gardener, but he turned out to be the risen Lord. Again, there are some similarities in the accounts about the angels, but there are also enough differences for people to say they contradict each other and therefore are not true. So those are the 2 big problems with the resurrection narratives. At first, they seem like big problems, but from my years of studying this and thinking about it, I think we can make sense of these apparent contradictions. I want to offer a few points that help me think about what's happening. First, we always summarize when we talk. If my wife asks me what I plan to do after work and I say, well, I need to go to the grocery store, I leave out that I first need to grab my keys out of the drawer, walk to my car, start my car, drive my car, and go on one of 2 main routes depending on whether I'm going to Kroger or H-E-B. You get the point. I might even need to stop for gas, but that stop isn't essential for me to tell my wife my plans. Now, if she's watching this, she's laughing at this example because I rarely go to the grocery store after work. So, with the gospel writers, they didn't include all the details they knew from the eyewitness testimonies about that morning. Each writer included only what was essential for him to tell his story. They are summarizing events. Second, we often compress events when we talk. This one is like the first, but not exactly. For example, say I went to the grocery store in the morning when my wife took the kids to the park. When I got home, I realized, I missed grabbing the meat for supper. So I make a second trip to the grocery store. She gets back from the park and sees my car is moved and asks, "Hey, where'd you been?" before she looked in the fridge. I told her I ran to the grocery store so she doesn't have to. Is that true? Yes. Do I need to tell her that I went twice? No. It's not essential to the story. Likewise, it's possible that the gospel writers may have compressed events that transpired during the resurrection stories. The writer may have needed to save space. But hang tight, I'll play through some likely scenarios in just a moment. Third point though, our words often offer snapshots of events. When we are summarizing and compressing stories, we still offer snapshots of what happened. And the tough part is that those snapshots might create a different picture in the mind of our hearers other than what happened. When I told my wife I was going to the store after work, she quite likely imagined me taking one route, but I quite likely went another. Or she may not have imagined me stopping to get gas. Or when I had to make 2 trips to the grocery store, she likely didn't imagine me doing it twice, only once. That's just the nature of language, and it's the reality of history. The tough part of aligning and comparing multiple snapshots of the same events as told by multiple people is that we don't have all the details. So it's often the skeptical folks who are wanting to fight or be difficult who want to pick apart stories to make it seem like you're lying. She wouldn't do this, but my wife could have tracked me on her phone and saw me stop at the corner of King Street and 423. She could have been like, "What were you doing? I thought you were going to the store." And I would say, "I was getting gas." Or she could have asked, "If you were going to the store, why didn't you take WIT?" And I would say, "Because I was going to Kroger, not HEB." Now, that's what it's like with many skeptics. Not all. Of course, there are many sincere people who simply can't accept the differences between the Gospel's resurrection stories. But there are many more who are just being difficult without actually trying to make sense of it. So let me turn to this next point. Fourth, the Gospel writers offer snapshots of multiple resurrection stories based on multiple accounts. That's why it's tricky. We have eyewitnesses who experienced something that day or received the news that day, and then they preserved and told their experiences. Their experiences were then circulated throughout the church for decades before they were assembled into the gospel accounts. So here are the possible or perhaps even likely scenarios that played out. The women made multiple trips to the tomb that Sunday morning. There may have been multiple groups or multiple individuals who went there one or more times. And it's the same with the angels. The first angel may have appeared and sat on the stone, and then he may have hopped down and walked into the tomb when another angel or two appeared. There may have been multiple appearances by multiple angels. But when a gospel writer focuses on only one angel or one woman, the writer isn't implying there was no one else there or nothing else happened. The writer may want to focus only on the one speaking or the one that suddenly appeared. The writer isn't obligated to record every single thing that happened or include everything he knew that happened in his account. He simply needs to record what's meaningful for his story. Cutting out events, cutting out people, or compressing and summarizing events into snapshots doesn't mean he isn't telling the truth. That's just how language works, and it's how we communicate. Fifth and last, if the early church was inventing these stories, we would likely have a single account that perfectly lines up all the details. Had they really fabricated the story, they likely would not have had women be the first people who encountered the empty tomb. That's due to cultural views of legal testimonies, which I have explained in another video. The writers would have lined up all the facts, but that's not what we have. And we don't have a perfectly polished story because the resurrection stories come from multiple eyewitnesses who each experienced the events of that Sunday a little differently, and then they shared what they experienced. Since we have multiple testimonies based on multiple eyewitnesses behind our 4 gospel accounts, it's more likely, in my opinion, that these stories arose and exist to this day because something actually happened. The eyewitnesses actually experienced something that day in the days onward. But I'll leave you to conclude what you think it was. Anyways, I hope this video was helpful for you to think through the resurrection stories. Be sure to check out my channel, like, subscribe, if you want more walks like this through God's Word. Of course, my name is Aaron. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.